Well, welcome everyone, even though you've not here been before. So,
Oh, Cleveland, all right.
if you haven't here before, you know this is the fourth and last of this series, talking about the idea that individuals ought to have the right to be free to believe what they believe and act on those beliefs as they see fit. The idea that the government should not be in the business of regulating people's beliefs and actions is reflected in the First Amendment to the Constitution as the Constitution. But as we will see today, and Jerry, this is going to tie back to what you guys have been talking about. The idea that the First Amendment means what it says took more than 100 years to become clear. And as we will also see, what it means today is not so clear yet. Okay, let's go next. So this is the First Amendment, United States Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Fearing that the states, this is directed to Congress, fearing that the states continue to deny religious freedom to their citizens, James Madison at the Constitutional Convention proposed that the states be required to provide religious freedom, and that was rejected. So today we will look at how courts have interpreted this and similar state provisions. We will see that the interpretation of this has been inconsistent and uncertain, eventually leading to the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which then led to the Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act. We'll look at some of the issues raised by that act. And then finally, you get to decide some cases involving claims of religious freedom. You're going to be the judge. So let's go to the next slide. So, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, John Adams, a Harvard lawyer, was a student of John Locke and came to reject major parts of Orthodox Christian theology. In 1797, President Adams presented to the Senate, and the Senate ratified a treaty with Tripoli, seeking to bring an end to the battles with the Barbary pirates. And here's what Article 11 of that provided. It's actually written out here, printed out here. As the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character to imitate against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Mussulman, which is the Mohammedans, and as the said states never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. The really important languages are the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. That's John Adams, 1797. Let's go next slide. In 1802, President Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Baptists in Banbury, Connecticut, and by the way, this is his letter. He just marks out and scribbles. So here's he wrote: I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people to declare that the legislature should, quote, make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise of, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. You've heard that, the wall of separation. This letter became important in the 20th century as the Supreme Court tried to determine the meaning of the First Amendment. Yet for most of the 19th century, quote, the wall of separation was more of an illusion than a reality as the country experienced a new wave of Christian renewal. The country's renewed sense of Christian identity, by the way, we're talking about now, not way after the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, was reflected in decisions coming from the state courts. Let's go to the next slide. For example, in 1810, a New Yorker named John Ruggles had too much to drink and shouted in the tavern, quote, Jesus Christ was a bastard and his mother must be a whore. Wow. He was convicted of blasphemy, sentenced to 3 months in prison, and fined $500, which today would be about $10,000. Ruggles appealed, contending his conviction violated the New York Constitution, which guaranteed, quote, the free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference should be forever therefore allowed within this state to all mankind. Here's what the New York highest court said, quote, the people of this state, in common with the people of this country, profess the general doctrines of Christianity as a rule of their faith and practice. And the author of these doctrines is not only in a religious point of view extremely impious, but even in respect to the obligations due to society, is a gross violation of decency and good order. That was the same rationale, keeping the good order, that John Calvin had used to impose his religious views on the citizens of Geneva, even to the point of the death penalty. And you see this idea repeated. The court reached that result, even though no law in New York made blasphemy a crime, finding that New York had inherited the common law of England, and quote, writings and actions which go to vilify those gospels continue as a common law, be an offense against the public peace and safety. So one author says, quote, the revival's decision was quote, a precedent that other courts received with eagerness in their own efforts to constrain what they saw as the pernicious side of individualism. So as one author wrote, quote, as the legal opinions kept coming, the slippage between the proclamation of disestablishment and its continuation in another form became even clearer. Those court decisions were of great concern to an aging Thomas Jefferson. In his autobiography written in 1821, Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which he considered the model for both the First Amendment and the religious freedom provisions in the state constitution, both comprehended within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination. And also then in 1821, Jefferson wrote a letter to John Adams, which he said, quote, this country, which has given to the world the example of physical liberty, owes to it that of moral emancipation also. For as yet it is but nominal with us. The inquisition of public opinion overwhelms in practice the freedom asserted by the laws in theory. Jefferson was particularly critical of state court decisions declaring that the Christian doctrines had been inherited from England by the common law. In 1824, and Jefferson just 2 years away from his death, he wrote a long letter congratulating John Cartwright, an English reformer, in his conclusion, well, judges have usurped and repeated decisions that Christianity is a part of the common law. Jefferson then sent out a legal analysis why Christianity could not be part of the common law of England. He said, well, the common law existed while the Anglo-Saxons were yet pagans, at a time when they had never yet heard the name of Christ pronounced, or knew that such a character had ever existed. So Joseph Story, for those who have gone to law school, have heard that many times. At that time, an associate justice of the Supreme Court, wrote a letter rejecting Jefferson's assertions, saying it was, quote, inconceivable that Christianity was not part of the common law. In 1893, Story published the influential commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, which he wrote, quote, the real object of the First Amendment was not to countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity or apostating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects, prevent any national ecclesiastical establishment which should give to a hierarchy the exclusive patronage of the national government. So we have Jefferson on one hand, the Constitution means the separation of church and state, and we have Joseph Story saying exactly the opposite. It could be more than 100 years before the Supreme Court decided which of these two views was correct. Also in 1833, the United States Supreme Court unanimously held that the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, did not apply to the states. So in 1837, Jefferson's argument that Christianity was not part of the common law was presented by the defendant in a Delaware blasphemy case, which a person ironically named Thomas Jefferson Chandler was accused of blasphemy for denying the virgin birth of Jesus. The court rejected Jefferson's arguments, saying, quote, it appears to have been long perfectly settled by the common law, that blasphemy against the deity in general, or malicious and wanton attack against the Christian religion individually, for the purpose of exposing its doctrines to contempt and ridicule, is indictable and punishable as a temporal offense. Courts also drew distinctions between laws that forced people to believe a certain way and laws that govern how they acted on those beliefs. For example, in 1838, the Massachusetts Supreme Court upheld a blasphemy conviction because the laws of blasphemy, quote, were not intended to prevent or restrain the formation of any opinions, of the profession of any religious statements, whatever, but to restrain and punish acts which have a tendency to disturb the peace. So we're worried about Christians getting into fights after they hear somebody denying the virgin birth. Sad commentary perhaps on Christians. So next slide. The distinctions between laws governing beliefs and those governing actions was at the heart of what became famous as the Eliot School Rebellion. In 1859, the vice principal of the Eliot School in Boston insisted that 11-year-old Thomas Wall, whose family was Roman Catholic, recite the Ten Commandments from the Protestant translation of the King James Bible as mandated by state law. Young Wall refused at the instruction of his father, an Irish immigrant, and was beaten repeatedly by the vice principal, leading to 300 students walking out of the school. Wall's father sued the vice principal for excessive force, putting at issue the propriety of forcing Catholic children to recite a rendering of the Ten Commandments that was inconsistent with their religious beliefs. The court ruled against the Walls, holding the requirement of reading the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments was supported by, quote, the almost unanimous voice of the people, almost all Protestant, of course, and Wall's refusal to accept that determination, quote, threatened the granite foundation on which our Republican form of government rests. The court based its decision on the fact that, quote, no scholar is requested to believe the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments, none to receive it as the only true version of the laws of God, only to recite it. In other words, so long as the state did not somehow force people to change their beliefs, it was fine to force them to act contrary to those beliefs.
What is the difference between the Catholic and Protestant versions of the Ten Commandments?
It was very important to the Wall.
Okay, clearly.
My guess is that you would have done it in Latin, not in the King James English.
Oh, that's not changing anything English. You're probably right.
Some of the
Probably right.
language of that.
The court worried that if Wall could insist on reciting only from the Catholic Bible, Jews could insist on reciting from their own translations, and the ultimate result would be to remove Bible reading from schools. The court believed that this outcome, the framers of the religious freedom provision of the Massachusetts Constitution, quote, could never have intended. As the blasphemy cases, worries about threatening the religious views of the majority, leading to violence, resulted in restricting the religious freedom of the minority, exactly the opposite of what Madison and Jefferson had originally intended. Let's go next one. The distinction between laws forcing beliefs and laws forcing actions were used by the United States Supreme Court in two cases involving the Mormons, who had been taught by Joseph Smith, the founder of their faith, that God required or at least allowed men to be polygamous. Because of this teaching, Smith's followers practiced polygamy in the Utah Territory, which at the time was controlled by the federal government and therefore subject to the First Amendment. Brigham Young, Joseph Smith's successor, had 55 wives during his lifetime. In 1862, Congress outlawed polygamy in the territories, but Mormons refused to obey the law because of what they considered their rights under the First Amendment. A Mormon polygamist was convicted of violating the law, and his case came to the United States Supreme Court, where he argued that the statute prohibiting polygamy was unconstitutional because he believed that failing to engage in polygamy would, quote, lead to damnation in the life to come. In the very first case, think about this, the very first case in the 1870s, dealing with religious freedom under the First Amendment, the Supreme Court rejected the claim that being subjected to eternal damnation gave him a right to ignore federal law. Relying on statements of Thomas Jefferson, the court concluded, quote, Congress was deprived of all legislative power for mere opinion, but was left free to reach actions which were in violation of social duties or subversive of good order. Harkening back to the examples that Jefferson and Locke had used to show the limits of religious freedom, the court asked rhetorically, quote, suppose one believed that human sacrifice were a necessary part of religious worship. Would it be seriously contended that the civil government under which he lived could not interfere to prevent a sacrifice? The court answered that question with a conclusion that remains relevant today. Quote, so as here, as a law of the organization of society under the exclusive dominion of the United States, it is provided that plural marriage shall not be allowed. Can a man excuse his practices to the contrary because of his religious belief? To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land. In effect, to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. Government could exist only in name under such circumstances. Excellent. The decision that laws against polygamy could be enforced did not stop the Mormons from disobeying the law. So in the 1880s, Congress passed harsh laws directed at all Mormons, which supporters of the laws deemed quote a heretical faith and threat to Christian culture. These laws passed despite opposition that the First Amendment prevented the government from destroying a religion, quote, whether false or true. And upholding these laws in 1890 against claims that they violated the First Amendment, the Supreme Court stated, quote, it was never intended or supposed that the amendment could be invoked as protection against legislation for the punishment of acts inimical to the peace, good order, and morals of society. However free the exercise of religion may be, it must be subordinate to the criminal laws of the country, passed with reference to actions regarded by general consent as properly the subjects of punitive legislation. As authority for the proposition that polygamy offended the peace, good order, and morals of society, the court cited, quote, the general consent of the Christian world in modern times. In other words, laws passed to enforce the views of the Orthodox Christian majority could be enforced no matter what effect it had on the religious practices of others. You can consider this almost the high water mark of this view. Let's go next one. After the Civil War, the country grew more diverse and more tolerant of non-traditional religious beliefs as people moved around the country and encountered new ideas. These new attitudes helped shape the presidential election of 1896 and 1900 as William McKinley, supported by the East and West Coast secular business interest, defeated William Jennings Bryan, a Christian populist who later testified against the teaching revolution and the so-called Spokesman Monkey trials. These more inclusive views began being reflected in state court cases involving claims of religious freedom. In 1894, a writer was charged with blasphemy under Kentucky law for ridiculing the Roman Catholic doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. A judge dismissed the charge, saying, quote, in the code of the laws of a country enjoying absolute religious freedom, there is no place for the common law crime of blasphemy. In 1904, since these are courts in the South, in 1904, the North Carolina Supreme Court flatly rejected the claim that, quote, Christianity is a part of the common law of the land because of constitutional provision, quote, denying religion any place in the supervision or control of secular activities. Sensing the changing attitude, a Christian group called the National Reform Association proposed an amendment to the United States Constitution to acknowledge the importance to the country of God and Jesus Christ. The effort failed. Excellent. Reflecting the changing attitudes of the United States, the Supreme Court began focusing on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution as a way of putting restrictions on laws that interfered with non-traditional religious beliefs and practices. There's Section 1 of the 14th Amendment enacted after the Civil War, quote, no state shall make or enforce any law which abridges the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Although the term liberty was intended primarily to protect freed slaves, its broad language protecting liberty was not limited. Let's go next slide. 1922, Oregon passed a law requiring all students to attend public school. The law supported by the Ku Klux Klan and was directed primarily at closing Roman Catholic private schools serving immigrants. Sisters of the Holy Names, who operated a Catholic school, brought a legal action claiming that this new law violated the rights of Oregon students and parents. The Supreme Court, 1925, agreed with the sisters, holding that the right to choose a religious school was a protected liberty under the 14th Amendment that the states could not take away. Excuse me, a few days later, the same Supreme Court decided that the liberties protected against state interference by the 14th Amendment include all the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. Lawyers call this the doctrine of incorporation. As a result of that, the court duplicated Madison's long ago scheme to modify the federal constitution, which states would be prohibited from violating fundamental rights. The Supreme Court's first opportunity to apply this idea involved Jehovah's Witnesses, who were involved in 23 cases in the Supreme Court between 1938 and 1946. 2 Jehovah's Witnesses were convicted in Connecticut state courts for soliciting without obtaining the required permit. One had been also convicted of breaching the peace by playing a record attacking the beliefs of Roman Catholics. The court rejected 19th century ideas of the First Amendment, now applicable to the states, limited only efforts to coerce beliefs, saying, quote, "This amendment embraces 2 concepts: freedom to believe and freedom to act. The first is absolute, but in the nature of things, the second cannot be. Conduct remains subject to regulation for the protection of society. But conduct under this court required by a person's religious beliefs could only be prohibited if, quote, it presented clear and present danger to substantial interest of the state." The court decided the requirement to get a permit interfered with a person's religious freedom, saying, quote, "To condition the solicitation of aid for the perpetuation of religious views or systems upon a license, the grant of which rests in the exercise of determination by state authority as to what is a religious cause, is to lay a forbidden burden on the exercise of liberty protected by the Constitution." The court also reversed the conviction for disparaging Catholics, saying, quote, "To persuade others to his own point of view, the pleader, as we know, at times resorts to exaggeration, the vilification of men who have been or are prominent in church or state, and even a false statement. But the people of this nation have ordained in the light of history that in spite of the probability of excesses and abuses, these liberties are, in the long view, essential to enlightened opinion and right conduct on the part of the citizens of a democracy." By this decision, according to one author, quote, "The court entered an entirely different intellectual world." The question now became whether restriction on practices motivated by religious beliefs was required by an important government interest. Striking that balance has not been easy or consistent, as shown by 2 almost identical decisions only 3 years apart. So next slide. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the biblical commandment against graven images precludes them from saluting or paying homage to a flag. After 2 Jehovah's Witness children were expelled from a public school for not saluting the flag, their father brought a lawsuit arguing the expulsion violated the children's right to be free to practice their faith. When the case reached the Supreme Court, Justice Frankfurter framed the question as to whether children, quote, "must be excused from conduct required of all the other children in the promotion of national cohesion." With one dissenter, The court held that the interest of national cohesion, reflected in the requirement to salute the flag, overweighed the children's interest in religious freedom. 1940. Other states then enacted laws requiring public school children to salute the flag. When Jehovah's Witnesses refused to salute the flag in violation of the West Virginia law, they're expelled from school and their parents threatened with prosecution for causing delinquency. In 1943, the Supreme Court in a 6-3 vote overruled its 3-year-old decision and held that requiring students to salute the flag violated the students' First Amendment rights to freedom of religion and freedom of speech, saying, quote, "If there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, is that no official higher petty can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein." Rejecting the logic that it forced young Wallace to recite the 10 Commandments in biblical language he did not believe, the court held, quote, "A person cannot be forced to utter what is not in his mind." 3 of the justices who had voted for the early result changed their mind about whether the government interest justified interference with religious beliefs. Justice Black and Douglas explained their change of mind. Quote, "Neither our domestic tranquility in peace nor war, our martial effort in war depend on, nor our martial effort in war depend on compelling little children to participate in a ceremony which ends in nothing for them but a fear of spiritual condemnation." Yeah.
Something about war in that quote, I didn't.
Yeah. "Neither our domestic tranquility and peace nor our martial effort in war."
So was their decision,
This is a decision in the middle of World War II.
yeah, do you think that's the reason why they were like, you have to say that? Pledge of Allegiance?
All I can tell you is it became clear 1940 and unclear 3 years later.
And what was happening?
And we were in the middle of a war at that
Same
time. We were in
time.
the middle of a war at that time. We were seeing what's going on in Germany at that time.
We were seeing nationalism then.
There's-
Of course.
Everybody see that? The court changes its mind in 3 years because of what's going on in the world.
And it's the same composition of
Of the court, same composition of the court,
So the original proposal, that was, what year was that?
1942.
Okay.
The war just began, press had not begun. But, okay. So now we have a new regime, right? Next slide. So 1947, in a case involving state support of transportation for students in parochial schools, all 9 members of the court accepted that the First Amendment required the complete separation of church and state. 1947. As a result, the government could not discriminate against, quote, Catholics, Lutherans, Mohammedans, Baptists, Jews, Methodists, non-believers, Presbyterians,
Great.
the members of any other faith because of their faith or lack of it.
Presbyterians come after non-believers.
Oh.
Sounds about right.
So how does the court get to this conclusion? It cites Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists as setting out the true meaning of the First Amendment. So the more than 100-year-old now debate between Thomas Jefferson and Joseph Story had finally been resolved in Jefferson's favor. The First Amendment is directed at more than the prohibition of a state church. This interpretation, let's go to the next slide, became clear in a case involving a Seventh-day Adventist who refused to work on Saturday. Because of her refusal to work on days assigned to her, which was their Sabbath, she was fired for cause and denied unemployment compensation. The Supreme Court held that the government had imposed a burden on her ability to act according to her beliefs, which of course held that Saturday is the Sabbath. And what became known as the Sherbert test, the court held that a burden on a person exercising his or her religious beliefs can be justified only if the government has a compelling interest justifying imposing that burden, and if no form of regulation could satisfy the government's interest without imposing that burden. Finding that the interest in requiring someone with a religious objection to work on Saturday was not compelling, the court reversed the denial of benefits. In 1972, Old Order Amish parents claimed that state laws requiring their children to attend school after 8th grade would, quote, endanger their own salvation and that of their children. Citing the Sherbert case, the Supreme Court held that the First Amendment protects acts required by a person's belief, even under regulations of general applicability. And holding the requiring children to attend school past 8th grade violated the rights of religious freedom, the court stated, quote, the essence of all that has been said and written on this subject is that only those interests of the highest order and those not otherwise served can overbalance legitimate claims to the free exercise of religion. Because most Amish students stayed on the farm, the court held the requirement to continue their education beyond 8th grade was not a state interest of the highest order, and therefore could not justify interfering with practices based on their religious beliefs. Next slide. 1990, the Supreme Court abruptly changed direction. 2 members of the Native American Church had been fired from their jobs as drug rehabilitation counselors for ingesting peyote, hallucinating drugs as part of their religious ceremonies. Because they were denied unemployment compensation, they sued, stating that their religious freedom had been violated in the same way that the rights of the Seventh-day Adventists had been violated in the Sherbert case. A divided Supreme Court rejected this claim. Quote, we have never held that an individual's religious beliefs excuse him from compliance with an otherwise valid law prohibiting conduct the state is free to regulate. As the 4 dissenters correctly pointed out, that statement simply ignored the 1972 case involving the Amish students who have been excused from required school attendance, and earlier cases excusing Jehovah's Witnesses from generally applicable laws. To support its result, the court's majority turned to its 1879 decision in the Reynolds case involving the Mormons, quote, were rejected the claim that criminal laws against polygamy could not be constitutionally applied to those whose religion commanded the practice. The court repeated its earlier rhetorical question from that case. Quote, can a man excuse his practices to the contrary of generally applicable laws because of his religious belief? To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious beliefs superior to the law of the land, in effect, to permit every citizen to become law unto himself. Next slide. The Smith decision, rejecting the Sherbert test and finding use of peyote in religious services illegal, was met with widespread and bipartisan opposition. Liberals saw it as a threat to non-traditional religions, while conservatives saw it as a threat to Christianity and increasingly secular culture. As a result, in 1993, Democratic Senator Charles Schumer introduced what became known as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, seeking to restore the Sherbert test to cases claiming that laws burdened a person's exercise of religion. The act unanimously passed the House of Representatives. Passed the Senate with 3 votes against and was signed into law by President Clinton.
So it was 93,
93.
not 70. I was trying to figure out the 93.
Here's the text of the act. In general, excuse me, government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability, except as provided in subsection B of this section. The exception, quote, government may substantially burden a person's exercise of religion only if it demonstrates an application of the burden into the person, quote, is in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest and is the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling government interest. And this is important. According to the act, religious exercise includes any exercise of religion, whether or not compelled by or central to a system of religious belief. Quote, religious exercise includes any exercise of religion, whether or not compelled by or central to a system of religious beliefs. At the time of the enactment of the Religious Freedom Act at the federal level, there's no evidence that anyone who supported the act thought it would protect anyone but human beings. exercising their own religious beliefs. But companies objecting to providing birth control for their employees argue that the term person should be interpreted by the Dictionary Act, which says the term person includes corporations. So in 2014, the Supreme Court accepted the argument in part in the Hobby Lobby case, holding that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act protects closely held for-profit corporations as well as individuals. As a result, the company did not have to provide birth control to its employees because that was inconsistent with the owner's religious beliefs. The Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act was enacted in 2015. I'm sure you'll remember that. It's been on television. Although it drew its name from the federal law, it differed from its federal counterpart in several ways that opponents found significant. First, there is nothing to be restored. The Indiana case rejected the application of the Sherbert test to religious freedom claims. Second, unlike the federal version, even as interpreted in the Hobby Lobby case, the Indiana Act applies even to the largest public corporations. Finally, the Indiana version expressly allows people to assert claims that their beliefs, that their rights have been violated, not just to defend claims against them. These differences were all cited by opponents who claimed the law was not needed and based on statements of opponents was intended to thwart laws against discrimination, particular laws directed at discrimination against LGBTQ individuals. The so-called fix, saying that Indiana's RFRA could not be used to defend against claims of illegal discrimination, is essentially an acknowledgement of that fact. Now, here's something you all may not know. Maybe Latin, just recently, the Indiana RFRA was the basis of a decision by the Indiana Court of Appeals, which held that Indiana's restrictive abortion laws cannot be enforced against people who sincerely held religious beliefs support their decision to get an abortion. Based on the Hobby Lobby decision at the federal level, the court rejected the idea that RFRA only protects acts done as a part of religious ritual. It includes acts done because of a person's religious belief. The court also held that because Indiana law allows abortions in the case of rape and incest, and allows in vitro fertilization, which often results in the destruction of a fetus, the state could not demonstrate a compelling interest in protecting unborn life. That case will now go to the Supreme Court.
Indiana Supreme Court.
Indiana Supreme Court.
And it was largely the Jewish
Yes.
group
Yeah.
that brought it.
Yeah.
That's what-
So since, the next one. So since John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, people of goodwill, struggled with how to resolve claims of religious freedom, they conflict with the right of a society to enact laws in the best interest of all people. I am now going to give you some examples of those conflicts and see how you would resolve them if you were the judge. So we do not have enough for everybody.
And if anyone needs pencil there.
Sure. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna go through these questions one at a time. We'll give a little context for these. I'm gonna have you score your vote. I'm gonna have you score your vote, and then at the end, we're gonna talk about these. What I got? What's your one?
We know each other.
I said right down.
Okay, question number one. Everybody ready? Question number one. Next slide. For the law banning wearing religious symbols, including headscarves, kippahs, turbans, and crosses by public servants illegally restrict the religious freedom. There are such laws in France and Quebec. The argument is such laws prohibit discrimination against people because of their religion, treating all people equally. So the question is, would this illegally restrict religious freedom under the test now of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? Does it restrict religious belief, and so is compelled by his serious government interest?
You're talking about the federal act.
Federal act. Because these are not necessarily Indiana cases. Okay, Mary, next question. Next question. but a requirement that everyone attending public school be vaccinated and legally restrict the religious freedom of parents who sincerely believe that vaccinations are against God's will. Child is to die, it is God's will.
So it looks like.
I want you to know. Get hard, by the way, these are easy.
I do more than that, but you can talk to that lady over there and say.
Okay, next one. Is it an illegal restriction of religious freedom for states' anti-discrimination laws to require that a baker create a custom wedding cake for marriage between two men when such a marriage is against that baker's sincerely held religious beliefs?
I like the cake topper.
I do too. I remember
That's
that.
another one.
They just did that.
Ready for the next one?
Yeah.
Next one.
I think that's.
Would it be an illegal restriction of a family's religious freedom for the government to deny benefits to a child who does not have a social security number when the parents sincerely believe that giving a child a number is prohibited by their religion?
Whoa.
Oh, wow.
Whoa. You know, this class was going along just fine. You mean you two are having trouble working together?
The next one. The city ordinance requiring that all memorials in the cemetery be flush to the ground and legally restrict the religious freedom of owners of plots who sincerely believe their religion requires the memorials be vertical.
Which religion is that?
Okay, next one.
It's legal.
There's state law enacted during the pandemic banning all gatherings of more than 10 unrelated people and legally restrict the religious freedom of people who sincerely believe that only worshiping of others in person satisfies God when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name.
That's which court you're presenting the case to.
If you're Boris Johnson, and you. Right, it's Boris Johnson, okay.
Okay, remember, next one. But a law barring full face covering and legally restrict religious freedom of Muslim women who sincerely believe that God requires their faces to be totally covered in public. This is being put forward as a public safety matter.
Are we supposed to be answering as we think or as we think the Indiana Supreme? Court?
No, listen, these are not all we yet. We'll be reasoning federal law, looking at. Okay, next one. Would a U.S. Army regulation requiring that soldiers be clean shaven and legally restrict the religious freedom of Sikh men who sincerely believe that God requires them to have beards? The government, the Army says we want our people to clean shaven for uniformity and for safety reasons. The response is, but you allow some men with skin conditions to have a short beard, white out a long beard.
The next one.
Safety for all.
Okay, next one. Does a law banning possession of poisonous snakes illegally restrict the religious freedom of people who sincerely believe that handling such snakes demonstrates their faith? The Bible says they were able to handle snakes without fear. And the evidence in this case shows that people actually died from this practice.
Every family vacation, my mom threatened to take us to a snake handling. That was always her, we're gonna go find them.
Okay, last one.
My grandpa could have taken you there.
Laws requiring that all children attend schools and legally restrict the religious freedom of Taliban families who sincerely believe God does not want their girls educated. Think about the almost.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody ready to reveal their
Oh,
answers?
yeah.
Do we have to tell you?
No.
So,
Yes, I want to see if we can, if we can see, number one, how hard this is, and number two, if we can find points of agreement here.
See if we can find somebody to sit on the judge.
Yes,
so I'm gonna make a statement before we even do this, that the wording of the
Oh, yeah.
question is the hardest part right there, to try and figure out, wait a minute, what are they?
Don says, welcome to law school.
Yeah.
Am I illegally restricting
way,
your
though.
ban on?
there's no doubt that these can be seen as religious freedom restrictions, right? The question is it illegal? Does it go past the, does a state entity require this? Okay, how many
And
think,
these are all structured, I think, so that you're asking whether the law would be illegal.
yes, the law, yes, sir.
Whether the law
Yes,
would be.
yes answers would all mean all of these are illegal restrictions, no answers would be none of them. That's the question. Yes, you're right. Okay, everybody ready to vote on the first question? How many thought this is an illegal restriction? Or against?
Yes.
So the answer would be yes.
How many thought this would be illegal, an illegal
How many,
restriction?
we all said yes.
You all said yes. Okay. The question here is, does any religion require this?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's a really good question.
That's a good question.
Uh-huh.
We're gonna see this. I'm just asking that question, right? Okay, when
Yeah.
you think of this, because we're gonna see that these questions have answers sometimes that are not consistent with each other. So let's go to the next one.
Oh, you're not gonna tell us yet?
But that's an open question. It's not,
These are
None
all.
of these,
France has it.
no answer.
France has this,
Oh.
Quebec has this. This has not been tested in that state. We don't have such laws. That's why it was written. Is this the second one?
Yes.
Would a requirement that everyone attending public schools be vaccinated to legally restrict the religious freedom of parents who sincerely believe that vaccinations are against God will? So yes means this would be restriction of freedom. They should be able to not be vaccinated, right? How many think this is a restriction on religious freedom? How many think it's not? See?
Except we always, when I was teaching, if a child wasn't vaccinated, they would send a letter out telling the parents that the child wasn't vaccinated, that they needed to get caught up on their vaccinations. However, they always said that if it is against your religious,
I'm just saying, this law doesn't, this does not have that exception. This says, for the safety of everybody, you have to be vaccinated or not go to public school. That's the context of
You
this
can make
question.
an argument that the public good here allows a trumping of something.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, right?
That's what I think the answer is, but I couldn't figure out if that was yes or no.
I know.
The argument against that, there was like herd immunity or
Right.
having, or like the fact that a lot of people, or not a lot of people,
Right.
there's.
Well, this is
Some
part of
other
it.
alternatives.
It's
they
the-
could
yeah,
say
I
it's
get-
So,
I
okay.
get, I.
yeah.
Sounds open to all or nothing.
We right now give students the option to opt out, but we also understand that that creates huge issues now because kids are getting these diseases that we can't control when they go home.
Like measles, right?
Measles. So yes, this issue is open. I'm gonna take some answers to these questions. This one's open. The next question. Is an illegal restriction of religious freedom if a state's anti-discrimination laws that require a baker to create a custom wedding cake for a marriage between two men when such marriage is against that baker's sincerely held religious beliefs? The key here is custom cake, which you have to basically mold something to. Okay, how many thought how many thought the baker should be required to make that cake?
Should be required.
Should be required. So the answer to this would be yes.
I put yes.
Are you saying what we think?
No,
What we
no.
think the court,
Well, I thought the court was a yes.
that they should be required?
Yeah.
No.
So I
Court said-
frame
court-
this
the court
in like,
decided they could.
if I wanna go to the pharmacy and like, this is the same question to me, if I wanna go to the pharmacy and get birth control pills. And the person says, oh, I can't give them to you because it's against my religion. So I think this is the same question, and so I think this is restricting.
It's
If
an
you're
open
not
question.
on service,
It is
you have
It's an
still
open
open?
question. The Supreme Court conducted this issue by sending facts to that case of clearly religious bias. This is an open question.
It's still open.
I think it's less about that and more the fact that it's a custom cake where it'd be more like if you went up to somebody and said, please make me these birth control pills that I will buy from you, rather than, like, cause like you said, I think it would be discrimination if it was just a pre-bought cake that they're trying
Would
to
be,
buy.
no doubt.
Yeah.
When you're offering a service and you say, oh, I only serve these kinds of people, then you can say, well, I only serve.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, again, how
I
many
only
people think the
serve-
baker should be required to bake the cake? Let's just have the show.
I think, I,
Okay, let's go next.
Yeah,
Okay, let's go next.
think they should have to
It
make
would be a legal restriction of a family's religious freedom from the government to deny benefits to a child who does not have a social security number when the parents sincerely believe giving the child a number is privilege. How many think that the government ought to be able to disallow those benefits? In other words, that would be a yes, this is a restriction. Okay, how many think this is an illegal restriction?
So just tell us yes or
Oh,
no.
yes means
Yes,
it's a restriction on religion. Yes means it's an illegal restriction on religion.
Okay.
Means the government can't do this. Okay. How many think the government should be able to do this? You see how hard these questions are?
Yeah.
Let's go next one.
Is it open too?
Well, and I-
That's an open question.
yeah, the child has no say in what their parents did, so.
Would a city ordinance require that all memorials and cemeteries be pledged to the ground and legally restrict the religious freedom of owners and plots who sincerely believe that religion requires a memorial? This is actual case. So how many think that should be that should be illegal? That you should be able to allow vertical memorial? Anybody think it should be illegal? Okay, the court said nobody can demonstrate that vertical memorials are part of their religion.
Right.
So that's an easy one,
They
right?
haven't been in New Jersey.
Right,
Yeah,
use
that's like
a different cemetery.
Well, that's the same thing with the baker though. You go someplace else. Okay, let's go next. How about this one? The state law prohibiting banning of more than 10 million people, legal restrict the religious freedom of people who think they have to worship together. These issues came up.
Yeah,
How many think it's illegal? It's illegal. How many think the government interest overcomes here? Okay,
Is that one settled?
no.
There's the theme.
Uh-huh.
Next,
It's like Montessori, there's
How about
no
this?
grade going.
how about this one? Will a law banning full face covering and legally restrict the religious freedom of Muslim women who sincerely believe that God requires their faces to be totally covered? How many think that's an illegal restriction? How many think it's not? It's a public safety argument.
Right.
Kind of depends on the context too, doesn't it? I mean,
Well, I guess you're walking in the street,
Show it.
if you're getting on an
TSA.
airplane with,
maybe you have to pick a point face. Okay, next one. The U.S. Army regulation, this is decided, U.S. Army regulation requiring soldiers to be clean shaven, to legally restrict the religious freedom of Sikh men who sincerely believe that God requires them to have beards. How many think that's an illegal restriction? The court said yes, because we do not require all men to be clean shaven. If you have a skin condition, you can have a short beard and there's no real difference between long beard and short. Got that one. Okay, next one. This is a real case, probably. This has been decided. Does the law banning the possession of poisonous snakes and legally restrict the religious freedom of people who sincerely believe that handling such snakes demonstrates their faith? How many think that restriction is illegal? Illegal.
So it would be a
Then yes.
It'd be a yes. How many believe that that restriction is illegal, meaning that people should be able to handle snakes? How many think that the government should be able to do this? The case says so many people, this is a Tennessee case, so many people are dying of snake bites, we're gonna have to outlaw this practice.
It's also bad for the environment. There to have snakes that don't belong in that place. Bad.
Well, tell you what, they pointed to the, I don't know where it is, it's in the Bible somewhere. People actually.
Yeah. I'm just saying, like,
It's in
it's
Mark, it's in a
harmful.
fabricated ending of the Gospel of Mark.
Okay, next one.
You must.
This is the hardest one of all. Do laws requiring that all children attend school legally restrict the religious freedom of Taliban families who sincerely believe God does not want their girls educated? Remember the honesty. Public schools cannot keep you past 8th grade. The Taliban says, well, that's the same for us. Our girls don't need to go to school at all.
We just don't want any Taliban in the US.
Or
So-
people who homeschool. I mean, there are some people who religiously homeschool,
But this is,
there, I know. but there-
I wouldn't do that though.
this is
Yeah,
to
but
say,
I
we're not
mean,
gonna give any
But
education at all.
there are these other examples where, for religious reasons, you deviate from
So how about the Taliban? I'm not gonna educate my girls, period.
Well,
I think
Here.
it's the right thing to get to,
they
We
can.
said
That's all.
because, the women and the small children, they never had a voice.
How about the high school kids, the Amish high school kids? They don't have a choice either. Okay,
it was no, I mean.
well, I don't
That
know.
one
This
was-
is.
We didn't vote.
Oh my God.
How many people think?
Yeah, how many people think that the Taliban should be able to keep their girls out of school?
personally or?
No, the court will decide, the court will decide this.
If the Amish can.
If the Amish can do it, why can't the Taliban?
I don't know.
Okay, now, I hope this demonstrates that this is not easy. But I also hope it demonstrates that we did in fact start with Christian nationalism in this country, and we had it for 100 years. Before the courts began going in another direction. The good news is that the Religious Freedom Restorations Act sort of locked that in, so the legislature would have to change it, the courts can't just unilaterally change it. John, you have comments about that?
Yeah, I just think it's worth repeating for, because this is not an intuitive idea for most non-lawyers. It wasn't for most law students either. That the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states until the Civil War amendments, until after the Civil War. They were limits only on the federal government. So freedom of speech could have been abridged by a state. And freedom of religion could have been abridged by a state as long as the state laws allowed it.
But we see, that's exactly right. But the states who are making this declaration that Christianity is part of the common law also had their own
Yeah. Like
non-discrimination
Virginia.
clauses in their constitutions, which they ignored. And the Supreme Court of the United States then, in the Mormon cases, said, we are a Christian country and we can impose that view on the Mormons because polygamy is against the Christian morals.
And the
Yes.
fact that
I think, was that
Chuck-
the phrasing of it, where they explicitly said that they were Christian, or was it more just that?
No, they said that the idea of the opposition to polygamy comes from the Christian ethic.
Okay, but they did say that, like,
They said that explicitly.
The quote was the modern Christian.
Modern Christian.
And when you go through the museum, they tell you it's only one particular sect of Mormonism that was polygamous and not everyone else. They want you to know that when you're going through things.
Okay, this is the last of these. I hope everybody's.
You're awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you.